Meteorological Organization. Ms. Mami Mitsutori has kindly agreed to join us. She's head of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Joining us by Zoom will be Dr. Maria Nera of the World Health Organization. As I said, again, a very important partner in compiling this atlas in view of the mortality statistics. We also have a couple of WMO technical experts on Zoom in case you have technical questions, and if we have detailed statistical questions, we can obviously deal with those at the end. So without any further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Tallis. Thank you.
So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this event where we are launching this WMO Atlas on mortality and economic losses related to weather and climate extremes during the past 50 years. And we are really grateful for UNDRR for very good cooperation, and also for World Health Organization, which has also contributed to this report. And nowadays we are of course very much concerned what's going to happen because of climate change, and the good news is that we have been able to minimize the amount of casualties once we have started having growing amount of disasters, heat waves, flooding events, drought, and especially most intense tropical storms like Ida, which has been hitting recently Louisiana and Mississippi in United States. So thanks to our early warning service improvement, we have been able to have a decrease of the casualties at these kind of events, but the bad news is that economic losses have been growing very rapidly, and this growth is supposed to continue. We are going to see more climatic extremes because of climate change, and this negative trend in climate will continue for the coming decades anyhow. And if we are successful with climate mitigation, we could stop this negative trend around 2060s. And if we are most lucky, we could limit the warming to 1.5 degrees. I would like to show you some statistics from this report and what has happened so far, and then I will show one slide also what may happen in the coming decades once we expect to see still a growth in the amount of disasters and their impact. Could I get the slides up, please? Yeah, so we have seen, could you move this a bit here, so I can operate it here. So the report that we are dealing with is dealing with the time period from 1917 to 2019, so until the normal period just before this COVID era, and here we have estimated both economic and human losses, and the perspective is global. And here you can see the events which have led to deaths, and you can see that it's very much related to developing countries, and it is we have seen drought and flooding events especially, which has led to hundreds of thousands of casualties in the worst case, and for example this drought in Ethiopia in the 80s led to 300,000 casualties, and we have also seen storm and flooding events in Bangladesh, which have had about the same amount of casualties as has been the case in Ethiopia. But this is very much has been very much hitting the less developed countries. And if you look at the economic losses, the picture is very different, and So far, the most expensive event has been Hurricane Katrina, which was destroying large parts of New Orleans, and we are just interested in seeing whether this most recent Hurricane Idai is going to exceed the damage caused by Katrina. Quite often these economic impacts are felt after the event, and that's likely to happen because we have seen major damage to the electric system in Louisiana, and there's even a chance that the economic loss will be higher than with Katrina. But if you look at this image, you can see that United States has been exposed to most expensive ones, and thereafter there's one flooding event which has been observed in China. And if you look at globally these first of all about the amount of disasters, you can see that there's been an increase in the amount of disasters, and the dominant ones here are flooding events and storms, and there has been a slight increase in both of them. And then if you look at the deaths, you can see that the death toll is getting down, and there's a little bit a new feature for the past 2 decades that heat waves have become new thing which wasn't observed in the past. This is a follow-up of climate change and warming of the planet. And down here you can see the economic losses, and there the trend is very clear. We have seen more than tripling of the damage during the past decades, and as I said, this is supposed to continue, and there the storms have been the most expensive one, and especially these tropical storms, both typhoons and hurricanes and cyclones. They have been the dominant one, and number 2 is flooding events. And if you look at the distribution of the hazards by type, first what kind of hazards we have observed, it's very much flooding and drought and storms. And if you look at the death tolls here, it's being caused by drought and storms, and especially tropical storms. And those have been also responsible for the flooding, and storms have been also driving the economic losses. And then one could say that the world is not even when it comes to impacts of these events. The deaths have been very much taking place in less developed countries, and whereas the economic losses have been highest in developed part of the world. And then about these tropical cyclones, that means hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones. And here you can see again that the less developed countries have been seeing largest amount of casualties, whereas the economic losses have been highest in United States. There's an exception of Puerto Rico, which practically belongs also to the United States. And in Puerto Rico, for example, many of the losses were observed 1 year after the event. For example, the healthcare system was broken down, and that's why that was one of the reasons for this after disaster losses. And finally, a couple of slides from the most recent IPCC report that we published 4 weeks ago, and there's an estimation how much man-made climate change has contributed to the amount of hot extremes. And here you can see world map in a little bit different form, but this is the world map. You can see Americas, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia there. And in almost the whole world we have seen a man-made increase of heat waves. Only exception is southern part of South America, and from Central Africa we don't have enough data to justify, but that's a global feature. And if you look at the heavy precipitation which leads to flooding, disasters, you can see that very large parts of the world has seen an increase in the amount of flooding events caused by heavy precipitation, and that's very much the case in Europe, Asia, southern part of Africa, and some parts of Americas, especially the eastern parts of Americas. But there are also many places in the world where this hasn't been observed. And on the contrary, we have seen also an increase, man-made increase of the drought so far, and you can see Mediterranean region, Western Europe, Central Asia, Eastern Asia, Southern Australia, and half of Africa, which has been exposed to drought because of climate change. And that's also the case in Western United States and eastern part of South America, and often these have also led to forest fires, which you have been observed. And this is my final slide telling what's going to happen in the future, and this is an estimate from IPCC report. If we would reach 2 degrees, the upper limit of Paris Agreement. So first of all, we have these continents where we expect to see higher temperatures and also more precipitation, and that's very much the case in parts of Asia and also parts of northern part of North America. And then we have areas which are going to get hotter and drier, and that's especially the Mediterranean region, Southern Africa, Australia, and both Americas. So this is how the future looks like, and this is bad news when it comes to amount of disasters, and also bad news when it comes to agricultural productivity of our planet. With these words, thanks for listening, and after we have heard other presentations, I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Professor Tallis. I'll just stop sharing the screen. Okay, and now I give the floor to Ms. Mitsutori. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to first applaud WMO colleagues under the leadership of Professor Petri Tallis for producing this very timely and important report indeed. As Professor Tallis already mentioned, the good news is that more lives are being saved because of enhanced early warning and early action. We see this from the Gulf of Mexico to the Bay of Bengal across the world. And this is thanks to advances in meteorology, satellite imagery, strong risk governance, etc., and thousands of lives have been saved. But again, as Professor Tallis mentioned, the number of affected people and the economic loss is getting higher and higher because of the increase in frequency and intensity of extreme weather events and climate change. And we've seen this this year alone during this summer. In the month of July, which was the hottest since records began, there were heat waves and there were floods. So we are not, unfortunately, in a safe place. And the report tells us that the 50-year trend is quite alarming. To give you some statistics, 31 million people were displaced by disasters last year. Now the number of people who are displaced by disaster is almost getting larger than the number of people displaced by conflict. People pushed into poverty because of disasters. Even before COVID-19, this was 26 million people per year. And of course, the number of people who go into hunger is increasing. And now with COVID and extreme weather events attacking us at the same time, we live in this what we call the multi-hazard world, and it demonstrates that we really need to invest more in disaster risk reduction and prevention, which is the mandate of my office. But there is one very good example where which shows that prevention is important, and this is the example that already Professor Tallis mentioned about Hurricane Idai. The economic loss indeed will be quite big, but the good news is that the Hurricane Idai, which in an uncanny way hit on the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, the mortality has been very, very low. And this is because the city of New Orleans and much of Louisiana, the city of New Orleans in particular, they invested in prevention. So what made the difference this time is that the city designed a new hurricane and storm damage risk reduction system, investing $14.5 billion in gates, flood walls, and levees that protected this once-in-a-century storm. And I think the important thing to emphasize here is that they did not wait for another century to do this. They did it very quickly, so 3 years, even 3 years before this was in place, and this is because the major loss of life has been avoided. But I'd like to also mention here that developing countries are not so fortunate. They lack resources, both financially and in terms of human resources as well. They do not have the resources to invest in disaster-resilient infrastructure, multi-hazard warning systems, or risk modeling. And this is the problem that we need to overcome, because these disasters affect everybody in the world, but they affect the people who are living in these developing countries disproportionately. The Atlas highlights that only half of the 193 WMO members have actually multi-hazard early warning systems. And there are gaps in weather and hydrological observing networks in Africa, parts of Latin America, and in the Pacific. And what we need to do now is to really enhance international cooperation, because without international cooperation, this will not happen, that the developing countries start investing more in prevention and disaster risk reduction. The call to G20 countries is that, of course, they need to step up in their promise. They need to deliver their promise to reduce greenhouse gas emission, but I would say that's not enough. They also have to enhance international cooperation to the global south. This year, on the 13th of October, the annual International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, we are focusing on enhancing international cooperation for disaster risk reduction and prevention. And again, I would like to say that this report, again, shows us that, yes, with early warning, early action, lives will be saved, but we need to do much more in order to make this a global phenomena. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. We will take questions at the end, so I'd now like to pass the floor to Dr. Maria Nera, who's joining us by Zoom. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Nera. Okay. Sorry, we're just having a few technical problems trying to get Dr. Nera.
I think now it's okay. Good morning, everyone. Greetings, and thank you very much for this important report. I would like to congratulate our colleagues from the World Meteorological Organization for this very important report and for giving us at the World Health Organization the opportunity to participate For us, the collaboration with the World Meteorological Organization has been extremely important. We work on the climate change and health, and we understand very much, and everybody's understanding, thanks to this collaboration as well, the very, very close linkages between the meteorological information, the meteorological situation, and how our early warning systems can contribute and align and cooperate for preventing more disasters. Let me as well say that this report, this important atlas, one of the key messages is once again the importance of primary prevention. And in public health, this is something that we know very well. Now, in the middle of this terrible pandemic, we recognize that it's not only responding to the cases, the people affected and having the best hospitals and therapeutics to take care, but it's the importance as well to look at the causes of this type of disasters. And obviously, looking at these early warning systems, once again, is very much stressed, and the importance of that has been highlighted by Professor Talas and as well from the colleague of the disasters prevention. So for us, clearly the importance of saving lives, if it's true that according to this important atlas, lives could be saved because of this preparedness, the importance of the on the response and having all the mechanisms for ensuring this preparedness and response is critical. And thanks to that, the mortality, the immediate mortality after the natural disaster could be reduced. It's important to know as well that those are the direct consequences. But if after that disaster, the agricultural capacity of that population has been reduced, if the flooding has destroyed their shelter, the health of the people will be very much conditioned. So the importance of early warnings, preparedness and response, the international cooperation, and the way to understand that how much for our health we are dependent on ecosystems, on better preparation, on agricultural production, and our dependence on access to safe food, safe water, and shelter is fundamental. So we will keep our collaboration with all the UN agencies, and now that we are preparing for reinforcing the world capacity for epidemic and pandemic preparedness and response, clearly the early warning systems related to the meteorological conditions and even more collaboration, strengthening as well the capacity that developing countries are now missing, it will be our objective. So thank you very much for the report. We are very much engaged and committed to keep this collaboration and stressing the importance of these early warning systems to save lives in future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nera. I'll now open the floor to questions. As usual, if you could just please identify yourself by your name, your media affiliation, and indicate to whom your question is directed. So I'll start with Nina Larson of the French news agency AFP.
Oh, sorry, I think my mic is open. Christiana here.
So we'll start with Christian Ulrich of the German news agency DPA, and then I see Nina also has a hand up, so we'll go to Nina after that.
Thank you, Claire, for taking my question. I would like to ask you, maybe Professor Talas, to zoom in a little bit on the last decade, because from the statistics here we can see that the number of disasters has actually gone down. Is that a fluke? Because there was a hiatus in the rise of the medium temperature from the late 90s to 2013-14? Or is there a trend within this decade that shows us that in the last few years things got worse? I think Madame Mitsutori mentioned that last year 31 million people were displaced by disaster. I wonder whether you have figures that show how this has been a rising trend in the last decade. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, that's a very good question, and there are different ways to classify these disasters. And for example, the insurance sector, German reinsurance company Munich Re is also making these estimates, and they have a lower threshold to classify individual cases as a disaster, and in their statistics they have shown a steady increase in the amount of disasters, both flooding, storms, and heat wave and drought events. Whereas this is based on University of Leuven statistics, and there they have more stringent criteria for classifying individual event as a major disaster, and these major disasters, according to their classification, has been slightly decreasing. Of course, the long-term trend, if you look at this 50 years, there has been an increase. But if you use this criteria of reinsurance companies, then they have been showing a steady increase in those amounts.
Ms. Mitsutori, do you want to say something?
Yes, actually, as I mentioned, the number of people who are displaced because of climate change, because of, let's say, extreme weather events, is now getting higher than the number of people who are being displaced by conflict. And this is something that has been happening not only since last year. So I don't have the exact figures right now, but I'm happy to provide this to you later on through my office.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Nina Larsen of the French news agency AFP.
Thank you very much for taking my question. I wanted to ask about Hurricane Ida. It was mentioned that Ida could potentially cause more economic losses than Katrina. I was hoping you could elaborate a bit on why that would be specifically, and I guess that would mean that the economic losses from Ida would be the highest on record. Is that correct? And also, sorry, if you could also just sort of say something about what this storm and the difference between Ida and Katrina would say, if that illustrates your point on how preparations have changed the dynamics, but I guess not when it comes to economic losses. Thank you.
Thank you. So we don't know the final costs yet. We just have learned that, for example, the electric system in Louisiana has been severely damaged, and that means that many of these economic losses that we will face, they are still coming. So we can say so something like in one month's time what was the final cost estimate. And of course the good news when it comes to Ida is that the casualties as compared to the Katrina, they were much lower. There were only a few casualties, and that's demonstrating that the whole chain from early warnings to early action and action of various authorities and evacuations has been functioning much better. And also in for example in New Orleans, they are now better prepared for facing these coastal inundation, which is related to these kind of events. But we also know that because of climate change, we have now more humidity in the atmosphere, which means that when it rains more, and these flooding events are getting worse, and also we have there's some scientific evidence that these systems are now moving a bit slower than in the past, and that's also making this flooding problem more severe.
Would you like to add anything? No. Okay. Okay, so the next question is Laurence Hierro of the Swiss news agency ATS. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. First, so you just said that early warning this time for IDA worked better. But are there some examples since the beginning of the pandemic where restrictions linked to the coronavirus has led to bigger problems in terms of early warning and evacuations of people? That's the first question. And secondly, you mentioned 2060 as a target where if mitigation measures are effective, it could be better. What will be the situation in 2030? Can you already anticipate with models either what could be the increase of economic losses or what could be the increase of instances of disasters? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good questions. First, about this COVID impact, we have seen difficulties in maintaining our observing systems. We have lost some observations, and also some of the national Met services have had difficulties in running their business as normally, and in less developed countries they are already having major difficulties in provision of good services. That's the case in about half of our member countries, and according to our statistics, we have lost observations, and also there have been difficulties in running the operational services, especially in less developed countries. So it will be interesting to see afterwards what kind of impact this has had, but we don't have the numbers yet, but we can clearly say that it has had a negative impact on especially less developed countries' ability to provide high quality early warning services. And as I said, this negative trend in climate will continue for the coming decades anyhow, and there's 40% probability that we would reach 1.5 degree warming during the next decade, and the most recent IPCC report showed that there are also some changes that we will see continuing for centuries or even thousands of years, and that means melting of the glaciers also here at the Alpine region, and then also the melting of snow and ice cover, and the sea level rise. Those will continue for at least hundreds of years, and in the worst case thousands of years. But this negative trend in high impact weather events, in flooding events, storms, drought, that's something that we can still influence, and if we are successful in reaching the Paris Agreement limits, we could stop this negative trend, and if we would be able to reach 1.5, that would be best for the welfare of mankind, and also when it comes to economic losses related to disasters. But anyhow, we will see an increase of the economic losses for the coming decades, and also higher impact on human well-being.
I just wanted to add to what Professor Tallas mentioned, that many countries have been actually suffering because of this multi-hazard reality since the beginning of COVID-19. There have been cyclones in India, Bangladesh, in Pacific Islands. There has been an earthquake in Croatia, and each and every time we know that the authorities for disaster risk management have been really struggling with this challenge of coping with multiple hazards. But this means that this is the reality that we are living in, and we cannot assume that even after COVID, that the multi-hazard world that we live in will change. One other thing on the economic loss is that definitely in absolute terms, the developed countries are having the biggest losses. But in terms of the percentage to the GDP, the developing countries and the ones which are least developed are also suffering a lot. So it doesn't really mean that if the absolute economic loss is low, that it hasn't had an impact. It is having a lot of impact in a lot of developing countries, and this is why, again, prevention, disaster risk reduction is very important.
Thank you. Peter Kenny.
Thanks for taking my question. Just wanted to get a bit of clarification about the number of people displaced due to climate change. Ms. Dory said it's greater than the number of people displaced by conflicts. And I also heard a figure mentioned during this question time, which I actually missed during the press conference, of 1.3 million people displaced due to natural disasters. So would the number of people displaced due to climate change be different to this 1.3 million? Could I have some clarification on that, maybe from Ms. Misituri and Professor Talas? Thank you.
So thank you very much for the question. So the data that we have currently is that last year alone, 31 million people were displaced by disasters. Excuse me. And as I mentioned, this is a rising trend, but again, we are happy to provide you more concrete figures in terms of displacement from disasters as compared to conflicts after this press conference through my office.
I could complement what may happen in the future. We have already seen, for example, drought affecting politics in the countries. We saw this Arab Spring rise 10 years ago, which was partly caused by severe drought, which led to doubling of the food price and unemployment of the agricultural employees, and we have such problems. More or less on persistent basis in Somalia at the moment. Somalia is an area which is exposed to drought. But in the future, we expect to see both the population growth, especially in Africa, and the climate change having a combined effect. If we are going to see 4 billion inhabitants in Africa by the end of this century, together with more severe drought events both in northern and southern part of Africa, this will for sure lead to major displacement and crises and perhaps also refugee crisis, which is supposed to hit also areas like Europe.
Okay, I'll take a couple of questions from the room now, and then we'll go back to the remote one. So, Jamie Keaton of Associated Press.
Good morning, and thank you. My question is for both of you. Professor Talas, this is a big study. I mean, it goes over a long period of time. There's a lot of information. Can you tell us a little bit about the difficulties collecting information, collecting data, and are you fully convinced that this really paints the comprehensive picture, or are there some holes in the information? And for Madam Misituri, you mentioned the 31 million people who have been displaced. How much does that part of it, you mentioned the fact that it has an impact on developing countries in particular. How much of that piece is being factored into the calculations of the economic impact? In other words, when people move across borders or move from their homes, what kind of impact? Is that part of the data, or is that simply too hard to tell or beyond the scope of this study? Thank you.
So if I would start, so of course we have some national statistics and some UN statistics on both the casualties and economic losses, but of course this classification of individual events, that's always the challenge. So quite often you have combined effects. For example, when the heat waves have been hitting Europe, for example 2003 and 2010, we have seen lots of casualties, and those people are quite similar people that have died because of COVID. It's people who have some basic diseases and who are elderly. So they may die a little bit earlier because of heat waves, and the same has happened with the COVID. But again, where to draw the line, that's not an easy case. But we have had systematic ways of estimating both casualty statistics and economic loss statistics.
Thank you very much. Just to complement to first question, so the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction asks member states to submit data around disaster loss, and the first target to which they submit data is mortality, and actually that is the one to which the countries submit most data, because it is the one which is, let's say, more easily gathered than economic loss or affected people. Having said that, as our colleague from WHO was saying, if you start thinking about indirect, even loss of life after a certain time period, then it becomes more complicated, because let's say in an earthquake you can say that 1,000 people died, but even among the survivors, if people die after that because of the injuries that they sustained at that time, or even mental health issues that lead to suicide or whatnot, how do you calculate this? This is a rather challenging issue. And answering your second question, so people who are displaced in this case would be categorized in what we call affected people, which is the second global target of Sendai Framework to let's reduce the number. So we don't actually, in the case of the Sendai Framework, and I imagine, but Professor Tallis, please correct me, that that is not included in the economic loss. Economic loss is more of the direct economic loss from disasters. But again, your question is a very good one, because if we don't really try to calculate and put in the data the indirect economic losses, the lost opportunity, even let's say lost opportunity from loss of education and whatnot, then we're not really capturing the real picture of what disasters do to sustainable development.
Thank you. Then a question from the back of the room. Okay.
Merci. Moussa Al-Mayrin TV. Je peux poser la question en français?
C'est possible, mais je préfère anglais.
Okay. About the urgently recommendation, if I say that, to face this disaster, and I have another question about Middle East. What is the situation in the Middle East, and if it's similar with the rest of the world? Thank you.
Yeah, one could say that. Sorry, my French is a bit limited. I understand it a bit, but it's better to speak English. Middle East is one of the hotspots worldwide. So we have two areas globally which have been exposed to more dramatic climate change than other parts of the world. Arctic is number one, and then Mediterranean region is number two. So we have seen. For example, this summer we broke all-time high in Europe, 48.8 degrees in southern Italy, and we have seen severe drought and forest fires in the region, and also we have severe water shortages in Middle East, and that's a source of conflicts and unrest, and unfortunately the future scenarios for the same region don't look very promising. It's going to be hotter and drier, and that's going to be negative when it comes to availability of water, bad news for agriculture and also for tourism. It may not be very attractive for people to spend their holidays once the temperature is 50 degrees or even higher, and when it's very dry. So that's I would say a source of unrest, and it has been a source of unrest. I already mentioned this Arab Spring case, and that kind of risk is growing for sure.
Thank you. If there's no more questions in the room, Paula?
I'm sorry.
Sorry. Just one follow-up, and then I'll go to Paula. Okay, so please, yes. You can have a follow-up, and then, okay.
My first question, it was about your recommendations, urgently recommendations, to face this disaster. Thank you.
Of course, the key priority for the welfare of mankind is to mitigate the climate change. So that's essential. But besides that, we have to adapt to climate change, and especially the richer countries have better means to adapt to climate change. But for example, for Middle East, we have fairly rich Arabic countries there. And WMO has been engaged in artificial rain making processes to study whether that's doable. But unfortunately, the results are such that we don't have enough capacity to make rain by injecting some chemicals in the clouds. But of course, one can use also energy to desalinate water and use that for agricultural purposes, and that's what, for example, Israel is fairly successfully doing. Although we need lots of energy for that purpose, but that's an opportunity. But in general, that's going to be a challenge, and the richer countries can protect their people by having more air conditioning and so forth, and do this desalination. And one of the challenges in the long run is going to be the sea level rise. We just published the most recent IPCC report, which was demonstrating that the sea level rise estimates are now a bit higher than they used to be, and the bad news is that this negative trend in sea level rise will continue for hundreds of years. So that's going to be also one of the problems for the low-lying countries in the region.
And I think it's in the press release too that there are some very important key lessons that have been learned from this report. And the first one is saying that it's not enough to look at what happened in the past. That we also have to look and have more data in the future about the probabilistic, climate change and how that is going to affect the occurrence of disasters. So I think that is one very good lesson, recommendation, that we have to look at both the past and the future. The second one, which is written here, which I think is very relevant too, is strengthen disaster risk financing mechanisms. This is what relates to what I mentioned, that we need to have more financing for prevention, and especially in order to make that happen in the developing countries, we need more international cooperation to happen. And then the third thing, and the most important thing I would say overall, is that, and this is what the Sendai framework says, and I think it is a lesson from this, we just tried until very recently to react to disasters after they happen, respond to it, and try to do humanitarian assistance. But the amount of money that's now needed for humanitarian assistance after a disaster has become so much that the world can cope with it. So we need to invest more money before disaster comes into managing the disaster risk, which will help to mitigate the impact of disasters. And Professor Telles gave the very good example of drought in Middle East and other places. Drought is a typical one. After a drought, we start to give emergency funding to the farmers or other people. We start to distribute food. But, there's much more that we can do before the drought comes in a more proactive way, in a way that a whole whole of society, government way to manage the drought risk. So I think those very important lessons come out from this very important report that WMO has launched. And again, I think it reveals a lot on what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you. I could still complement. It was important what Mami just said. These early warning services, they are also highly important and highly good way to adapt to climate change. And only half of our members have proper early warning services, and most of our members are not able to forecast the impact of weather event, and that's why the authorities that are dealing with disasters, they don't get the proper information, and they are not acting as needed. And we also have major gaps in the observing systems in Africa and Caribbean, Pacific Islands, and some parts of Latin America, which is having a negative impact on the quality of the early warning services. So there's a need to invest both in the observing systems and early warning service capabilities of the countries, and also to educate the various authorities, which UNDRR is very much doing. And also we have started the provision of services for the UN sister organizations. We have lots of humanitarian agencies in the UN, and once they know, sometimes even a month ahead, that the drought is going to hit some parts of the world, they can prepare their assistance much better. And these high impact weather events like flooding or storms, they can be forecasted typically 1 week ahead. And once the humanitarian players and also Red Cross, which is close to here, they are prepared, they can target their resources more wisely, and we can save lives and also avoid some economic losses.
Thank you. We have a comment in the chat on can we send the number of climate change refugees as soon as possible? We will work with UNDRR to do that. The WMO annual State of the Climate reports, we now incorporate figures from both the International Organization for Migration and the UN Refugee Agency on displacement and due to high impact weather, but we'll get you that figure, Lisa. I have 2 more questions, and then we do need to wrap up just because of time. So we'll go to Paula and then to Gabriella. So Paula, please ask your question.
Yes, hi, good morning. It's for the New Humanitarian. I just wanted to know on the last point that you actually discussed a little bit further, regarding the lacking weather monitoring capacities and early warning systems that you have in those regions in Africa, Pacific, and Latin America. I mean, is there a concern that because of those shortfalls that we might not be then getting a full picture of the future impact of of all of these disasters, and that perhaps the situation may be even worse? Is that a possibility?
Thanks. Good question. We can, for example, compare what happened after Cyclone Idai was hitting Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi 2 years ago. In Mozambique, they were able to forecast the rainfall, the coastal inundation, and high wind speeds almost quite okay, but they were not able to forecast the impact of those of such an event, and the local authorities were not acting as has been the case, for example, in the USA, where the system is functioning in an optimal way, and they can evacuate the people, and they can avoid many damages by doing so. And in the case of this Idai in Zimbabwe and Malawi, they were not at all able to forecast event, so it just happened, and that's sometimes the case in less developed countries, and the lack of basic observations is having a negative impact on the quality of those early warning services. We say that we are using these forecasting models, and we say that if you put junk in those forecast models, you will get junk out. So that's one of our obstacles, and the WMO is very much serving as a platform to transfer the good know-how from the most developed member countries to the less developed ones, and we are happy that some of the donor countries have invested money in that field. We have, for example, a financing mechanism for early warning services called CRUISE, which is a joint one with UNDRR and World Bank, and we are just preparing a new financing mechanism for enhancing the amount of observations, especially in Africa, Caribbean, Pacific Islands, and some parts of Latin America.
The final question, Gabriela Sotomayor from Mexico. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. Yes, I have two questions actually. If countries like Mexico, for example, we are affected by climate change, but also by disasters that are not related to climate change, such as earthquakes, for example. So what do these countries need to make more serious measures, to take more serious measures to face this situation? And the second question, according to the report, the United States is one of the most affected, but the previous government left the Paris Agreement. Do you think that the attitude of the previous government also affected the perception that many people have in that country of the effects of climate change? Thank you.
I could start, and Mami might answer this multi-hazard case. So what we are very much promoting together with UNDRR is to create national multi-hazard early warning service systems and centers. And in the home country of Mami, for example, in Japan, they are talking about that they are a department store of all kinds of disasters. They are also having earthquakes and tsunamis and so forth. And they are able to forecast the things under one umbrella. The Japanese Meteorological Agency is having responsibility for all disasters, and that's what we are very much promoting. And in case of Mexico, there's really a need to enhance the meteorological services there. Many similar size of countries and similar size economies have much more advanced met services, and in your case you have fairly advanced hydrological institution, CONAGUA, but the met service really needs further development. And then about this US situation, actually there has been progress in climate mitigation even under the previous administration. USA has already fulfilled half of their Paris pledges, and of course the current administration is trying to make a boost there, and President Biden has hosted last March very important meeting where he was trying to enhance the ambition level of mitigation, and the target was very much for the coming 10 years. We have to start acting already during this decade to be successful in reaching the Paris limits. But Mami might complement when it comes to this multi-hazard approach.
Yes, very quickly. So indeed, countries like Mexico and Japan, which face all sorts of natural hazards, not only the ones related to climate change, but also geophysical hazards, do have to have enhanced plan for disaster risk reduction. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction calls for every country to have their national strategy for disaster risk reduction. And in this national strategy, all hazards that have historically affected a country and the future probabilities need to be included. And in the case of Mexico, as you have rightly pointed out, there is a rather long list of hazards that need to be included in it. And I would also say that countries which are affected by more different types of hazards historically and in the future, they would need to invest more in the prevention in terms of budget, but also in terms of human resources.
Thank you very much. I think with that we will wrap up. Thank you very much indeed for participating. Special thanks to our two panelists, but also to Dr. Nera, who's been very patiently waiting on Zoom. No questions, but obviously if you do have questions specifically on the health aspect, as I said, we did work very closely with both Dr. Nera, WHO, and also with Public Health England, and so if you do have follow-up questions on the health, we can certainly forward those to them. So thank you very much indeed, everybody, and thank you.